So this example is slightly more complex than the previous example. Clearly what we have here is our low poly comprised of 18 different objects or components, and our high poly also comprising of 18 different components. So the high poly is currently hidden. I'll just unhide that. So if we look at a high poly over here, nicely detailed and lots going on. No sculpting as such. We'll get the majority of detail via Substance Painter, I suppose. We could always sculpt it, the polys are there, I suppose. We could do that in the long run. Anyway, so the thing to note here is that you are trying to create some form of detailed asset with multiple components, and if you were to try and bake without using correct naming conventions, then that's going to be very problematic. So if we were to attempt to bake this without the mesh names created correctly, then that's going to cause an issue, and we'll show you exactly what's going to happen there in a few moments. So currently we have our low poly, and that is comprised of 2 different materials, and as shown previously, each one of those materials will effectively be a different texture. So whatever you see in grey is clearly going to be one type of texture or one texture set, and whatever is this muddy yellow is going to be another particular texture set. So the thing to note is there is no right or wrong in terms of does this, for example, go in the second one, does this one go in this one, or this one go into that one. There is no right or wrong. All that matters is you're trying to maximize the textile rate within the actual UV editor itself. If I just look at my current UVs, so what I've done here is I've deliberately just moved mine across. So you can see here this is my grey material and UVs, and effectively this is my muddy yellow. So what I've tried to do is I've tried to maintain the correct textile rate, and I know the textile rate is correct within Maya because Maya has this functionality where I can essentially select a shell, and then I can literally say, right, get the textile rate for that. So in this case, if I click on get, it's going to tell me the numerical value in terms of the textile rate, in this case 1.825 and then if I check this one over here and do get on that, then this one is 1.256, so it's 0.001 off, which essentially means it's identical, literally identical. So the textures UV textile rate is definitely the same for both particular UV sets. So to do that within 3ds Max, all you are going to do is create a secondary or define which components of your object are going to go into the secondary UV set, and then to unwrap both as per usual, pack both, and then if you don't have this feature within Max 2017, then literally do by eye. If you were to have the UV checker texture, for example, you can clearly scale the UVs up and down and match the actual textile rate by eye. If you are a few pixels out, it's not as the case you're going to notice it really, but nonetheless you should try and be as accurate as possible. So as far as I'm concerned, these 2 texture sets currently match. Obviously this particular texture set is outside of my UV space. It should be over here, so I will need to move that back into place prior to doing the actual export. But for the purpose of this, all I did, I've just moved it across so we can visualize what's going on. So to cut long story short, define via material which objects are going to go into the secondary UV set, ensure the textile rate for both match, ensure you try and use as much space as possible within both textures. Naturally there is always going to be empty space, so for example these little small components I suppose could easily go into here, but then there'll be lots of empty space in there. So the reality of it is that you're never ever going to have, or highly unlikely you're going to have, 2 perfect UV sets or textures, and both are absolutely rammed. In many ways they're both optimal, it will do. So let's see what happens if we try and export this without setting the naming correctly, although I have done on here, try and use some logical sense. So in this instance I've got P1_LP, which essentially is like part 1, and obviously I name mine P2 or P1_HP, shall I say. If you try and adopt a policy where these are, rather than having part 1, part 2, part 3, part 4, part 5, 6, 7, 8, then try and use a bit of common sense. As long as the projection cage doesn't intersect, as in you have objects which are directly on top of each other, then that this methodology of essentially having attaching objects together that don't necessarily connect directly to each other or don't directly sit directly on top of each other but are just merged together as one object, this process will work very, very, very well. So, it's just a bit of common sense, really. It doesn't make much of a difference, which of these objects attach to which, as long as they don't sit on top of each other. So naturally, for example, this here, this particular component sits directly on top of that. So if I have this as within the same UV set as this, then that's going to cause a normal map bake issue. So all I do is I just separate it off via the actual naming of the individual components, not necessarily the materials, if that makes sense. So let's see what happens if we try and bake this without using the correct naming convention. So what I'll do in the first instance, I'm just going to export this out and see where we go from there. So file export selection, I'm just going to overwrite my pre-existing test bake, so low poly. I need to make sure that smoothing groups and triangulate are on for the low poly. Just say yes, that's good enough to go. I'm going to unhide my high poly. I'm going to select my high poly. Just on a side note, obviously I'm using Maya, but the general outline, which is this over here, is the same as what you have within 3ds Max. So let's just confirm we have just our high poly. Just move across to the side, that looks good. So let's export our high poly now. And I'm just going to export overwrite the existing one. So for the high poly, you want smoothing groups on and triangulate off. And just hit export selection. The FBX exporter within Maya is generally quite quick. It tends to do a good job. There we are, it's all done. I'm just going to save that, play it safe. Let's just pop into Substance Painter. Still got our existing scene in there, so we'll just discard all of that. So PBR Metallic Rough is the correct one. DirectX 2048. Select your low poly. And initially hit OK. On a side note, what we do need to do, I'm just going to triple check to confirm everything's good. The one thing you do need to be wary of is within your low poly, you need to make sure the smoothing groups are indeed correct. So if we look at this carefully, wherever I have a 90-degree angle, I've put a smoothing group break in there, and there'll be a corresponding UV break within the actual UV seams themselves. So triple check that as well. If you don't necessarily do that, it can cause issues in the long run. It can be very, 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 very problematic to think about it. If I look at this carefully over here, I've just missed this section over here, so that would need a fix actually. So you can see here that this particular bit over here could do with the break. This one's got a bevel on there, so no need to necessarily do that. These edges aren't 90 degrees, so they're okay. But I probably should go back and fix those other ones. So I've just naturally, in the process of doing that, I've actually missed that out accidentally. So let's actually just whiz around and repair that. So this particular section over here, it should have a hard edge in there because it is 90 degrees. And I'm also going to confirm that, so just confirm, and this one as well. So I suppose I'm only human. Those are now indeed correct, and the rest of it looks okay. What I would do is I'd probably just do the bake and then I'll quickly whiz around. If anything else is incorrect, I'll just whiz around and check it again. Naturally, when you have a very complex object, then it's understandable that you are going to miss some of these hard-edged 90-degree edges. You just need to whiz back around at some point and then fix them as the case may be. So with that one fixed, I'm just quickly checking other bits. They seem to look okay, but those two were definitely incorrect. So God forbid, should I continue with that? And this one over here, could have sworn I'd done all this, but clearly that's incorrect as well, so I need to fix that as well. Hard edge, great stuff. So with those ones done, I do need to go back in there and check, triple check to make sure that these now have the correct UVs. It's a good thing that that's happened, because at least you get an understanding of how easy it is to mess something up and essentially miss it out. So clearly we need a break in there because that's a 90-degree edge. I'm just going to double click on that and Shift X just to put a break in there, which is that one there. And this particular one over here, let's find out where that is. That's currently broke off there, so I'm just going to click that edge, put a break in there, and then what I will do to make my life easier, I'm just going to scale this in ever so slightly. and that's sufficient enough. Let's see where we are with this. I'm just going to move this over slightly. In fact, just because I don't want to have to UV all of this again, I'm literally just going to somewhat cheat and just move these so they don't overlap. And now what I should do really is check everything to make sure it's all good. I'm just going to hide my high poly one again. Just do a quick drag select. And just confirm with those areas where we made the fix that things are still good to go. So I'm just going to figure out which bits I fixed. That one's okay. And then there was this one over here as well. Right, so that's now been fixed. I had to pause it because Maya is extremely unpredictable. For some stupid reason, I lost all my UVs, they were all over the place. So I had to essentially restart Maya and check the file, and it seems to be okay now. So I've also checked to make sure that this particular section is in fact separated, which it is. These two, bizarrely, weirdly, are now okay. Yeah, so I'm not quite sure what went on there because I could have sworn I'd fixed that, and then oddly, it's now seemed to revert back to the fixed version of that. So anyway, Maya being unpredictable, because I did sit there and think I'm sure I could fix all that. I'm sure I would have missed those 90-degree angles, and yeah, it's done now, isn't it? I suppose. Just check a couple of the things over here. You can see that one's done as well. That one's okay, and that one's okay as well. Great stuff. So we're in the process now where we can give it a twirl and find out what's going on. So all I do is I just quickly group these into here. I'm going to save that actually before I do anything else. And I'm just going to take them back out and put them back in my low poly. Try and avoid having lots of groups with inside stuff. And then just confirm that those are good to go. Yep, they are. That's everything there. So I do need to move back my secondary UV set. So these particular shells over here do need to be moved back across into 0 to 1 UV space. So I suppose I'll do that next, and then I'll try doing an export and see what's going on there. So I'm just going to close that down temporarily. I will need to select all my yellow ones. The select by material can be a bit unpredictable, I've noticed, so I tend to do by eye. Yeah, I know a fair few students have had issues with Max 2017, but believe me, you're not the only ones. You know, Maya has its fair share of nuances and quirks, really. Okay, that's good. All I've done is I've just selected my secondary UV ones, which are these over here. I'm just going to select these particular UV shells. I want to make sure that my translate snaps are on, so transform step snaps. I'm just going to put that onto on, and then it should allow me just to move that across back into 0 to 1 UV space, so that's good to go. That should be fine. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to save that again. And no harm in checking, just press Ctrl U again and just confirm things are good. There's nothing outside 0 to 1, which they're all good. Again, you know, it's one of those things where I would advise you to constantly check to make sure things are still good. You know, you don't want to be wasting time doing that bake and then realizing, you know, there's some slight minor errors. Likewise, you know, thankfully we did spot that issue nice and early on, even though I had actually fixed it at some point, but it seemed to miraculously come back. I'm not quite sure what was going on there. But nonetheless, checking it constantly prior to doing any bakes is highly, highly advisable. So now let's just export this out. So what we're going to do now is we're going to assume that we haven't done our naming conventions correctly, and we're just going to bake it as one big lump and then see what happens. So I'm just going to export that back out again. Just going to overwrite my previous low poly. Smooth and groups and triangulate for our low poly. Looking okay. I'm just going to unhide my high poly. I'm just going to confirm I've still got the 18 in there, that's good. And then just do an export on that. and overwrite my high poly over here and make sure triangulate is off and export. And let's just load that up into Substance Painter. We will need to overwrite this because obviously I've made some fixes, so remember how the actual hard edge in here was non-existent. It's now been fixed, so we can just load that back up. Don't forget F1, F2, F3 will allow you to cycle through perspective and shaded. So F1 will show you 3D perspective view and obviously the UVs over here. F2 will just show the 3D and F3 will just show the actual UV. I tend to just work on F2 because it just makes life a bit easier. So let's just overwrite this file with the previous one, so project configuration, reselect our low poly and just agree with the defaults, and naturally we should find, yep, the hard edges are now present in that particular section. So the mesh itself, it should correspond with whatever we see in Maya. So again, no harm in just quickly whizzing around and checking again to make sure things are good. And once you're convinced they are, confirm you do in fact have both those materials. So you can see we have both materials here. Now I would suggest you name these so that they are, do make a bit more sense. Whatever material name you pop on there will naturally appear in here. So let's click on Bake Textures. This time around, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put it on 2048, and I'm not going to have match by mesh name. So I'm going to click on the plus icon, HB FBX. So let's assume that for whatever reason I didn't understand how to do the naming convention correctly, and I left my match on always, and I'll leave this on incorrect as well, underscore high and underscore low. Ours should be underscore HP underscore LP. So let's assume that those are incorrect as well, which they are, and then hit a bake and then see what happens. So 2048. Now what I'll do is I will pause my video obviously while this bake goes on. But before I do that, I do need to remind you that when you are looking to bake high resolution onto low resolution on multiple UV sets, you do need to ensure that instead of just pressing Bake Lambert 1, that will essentially create the norm maps for just one of the materials / UV sets or texture sets. We need to click on Bake All Sets. So if I click on Bake All Sets, that will ensure that it uses a high poly for both particular textures. So that's now off and away. It's slowly but surely doing its thing. This will take a while. I can't remember whether I put my anti-aliasing on to 4x4, which is obviously ideally what you want, but it doesn't necessarily make much difference for this, because what we're trying to do is trying to find out what happens when you don't correctly identify your actual mesh names, and let's see what happens. So it will just take its time. So it is advisable, and I clicked on size 2048 by 2048. It might be wise to do this initial bake at 512 or 1024, just to try and quickly visualize where there's potential issues. And once you are convinced that you fixed everything, then you can whiz around and go back in there and make the necessary changes. So if we look at this carefully, it's now finished. So we have lots and lots of bleeding going on. So you can see here, non-matte bake issues getting bled onto this section over here. You can see here there's lots and lots of areas where the non-matte cage is in this section, and there's a big bleed issue over here. And likewise over here, you can see that just about in every place, including these bits over here, lots and lots of errors. Lots and lots of errors. So the way to resolve that is to triple check to make sure that you are using correct mesh names, and you've split your smoothing groups correctly as well, and put the hard edges in there. Again, you can see there's errors there. So let's try that again, but this time around what I'm going to do is I'm going to click on Bake Textures, and this time around we are going to do it correctly. So we no need to re-export the low poly and high poly. Literally the correct settings would be match by mesh name, anti-aliasing 4x4. You can always put this onto 2x2 just to do things quickly. I'll leave it on 4x4 and pause the video, and our high poly suffix needs to be underscore HP and underscore LP. It naturally needs to correspond with whatever we have done within Max or Maya. So I'm just going to click on Bake All Texture Sets and go make a cup of tea. Well, that's finished. It took roughly around 10 minutes, I think, there and thereabouts, which wasn't too bad, I suppose, but nonetheless, cup of tea time. So just bear that in mind that, I was doing 2048 by 2048. I also have 4.5 overclock processors, 4.5 GHz processors plus 64 gig of RAM, and I'm still having to wait 28 minutes, and that was at 2048. So naturally, if I bump this up to 4096, then it's not cup of tea time, it's go to sleep time really. So let's just compare this to what we had previously. So that looks fine there. Previously, remember, we had lots of intersection issues going on with the cage over there. Those are now okay. And slight issue over here, you can see over here, if we look carefully over here, we can see there's some problem in terms of the intersections. So that would need looking at in the long run, so we'd have to go back into our max file and make the fix. So rather than ignore it and think, well, hey ho, this is something that is easily repairable. It's simply a matter of going back in there and checking the UVs and checking the naming conventions on these particular sections to make sure they play ball. Obviously, I'm not going to do that now, but you would. Well, I would do that if I was doing it properly, I suppose. But I'm not going to do that now. The rest of it seems okay. So yeah, it wasn't too bad. Slight issue over here. You can see there's something funny going on over there. So something funny going over there. So there's 3 potential issues I would need to go back and fix. So I am trying to make a note of what areas work and what areas don't. And here we have a slight issue with the cage. It's still screwed over here really. So there's 4, I think that was 4 anyway, 4 or 5 particular areas where it hasn't quite worked, which is fine. That is, to be expected. I'm not going to get it perfectly fine every single time, first time around. So we literally just go back into those sections, check to see what's going on there, check the norms, check the UV seams, check the smoothing groups, and also triple check to make sure the naming conventions are correct for those areas, because obviously they're intersecting at the moment, it's safe to say. So I'm going to assume that everything's all good to go, rather than going back in there and making that fix, I suppose. Right, so obviously, as I said previously, we've now got 2 textures, and now it's just simply a matter of dropping your textures in there and getting a flavour for what it might look like. So I've got some pre-existing ones that I've made, so I'm just going to find one of mine. SR_, I've got my shelf currently way above here, just to make life a bit easier for me. In fact, I'll just pop it on there for the time being. Let's go to Smart Materials, SR_. In fact, it's not that one. I'll find my container. There we are. So my container metal, I can use that generally for most things. So I'll just drop that on there. Give it a few moments to compute its thing, and then see what that looks like and get a flavour for what it's going to ultimately look like. I'll pause that again. We are waiting a fair length of time just to compute that particular material. So just be wary of doing things at 2048 even. I mean, it may even be worthwhile considering 1024 worst case scenario. So trying to do this on a laptop, for example could be potentially catastrophic, I suppose. And depending on what settings I've got in my material over there, the custom material that I've made, I just need to check to make sure things don't screw up over here. So that looks okay, that's fine, I suppose. Yeah. Again, we're just using this as a testing phase. So now that I've got my container material over there, it is simply a matter of copying the layer, going to my secondary texture over here, and just pasting that on top. So just click on the paste layers, and again wait a while for it to compute, and you're off and away after that. I'm going to pause it now. There we are, that's now baked. It only took a minute or so. Anyhow, so if we now go back to those areas which we know were screwed, and then make a judgment call over, is it worthwhile going back and making those fixes? So remember how there was an error over here, and you can barely notice it now that the material's on there. In fact, you can't notice it at all, really. I'll click on that one. Let's just find where that was again. Compare before and after. Well, we will do, but it's so damn slow. So here, remember how there was an error over here? And I believe there was an error over here somewhere. Yep, you can see the issue over here. So again, let's just unhide that particular container smart mask, and now you can barely see the issue. You can barely see the issue. That does not mean that you leave it. Ultimately, you know, I would advise you to go back in there and make every fix as well as you can, because that's going to, you know, differentiate you from somebody who's a bit slapdash and leaves errors in there just because they want to try and get an asset finished. Now, in the long run, if time was an issue, then hey ho, in industry you can survive and get away with doing that. If time really was an issue, but even then, I'd probably stay back a couple of hours, you know, after work and get it fixed, because, you know, ultimately you want to be proud of your work, so to speak. You can press tab as well and just get a flavour for what's going on with your assets. So, you know, if I'm not doing a great deal, you know, I've just made a custom shader in the past, I can slap that on there, and I've got a good basis now to work from. Try and, you know, add additional materials and textures on there to try and make it look quite interesting. So have a go at creating your two materials, ensuring your UVs are separated, texel rates correct, smoother groups are correct, and the bake goes to plan. If for whatever reason doesn't go to plan, you just go back to those key issues that can impact the quality of your normal maps and triple check every last one, slowly but surely. You know, naturally the first time around you are going to encounter probably 10-15 issues, and then you whittle them down, and eventually, like what I had, you could potentially just have 2 or 3, and then you would just go back and spend, you know, an hour or two just going in there making those fixes so everything is good again. So give that a go.